Hello, fluoroquinolone community. My name is Ron Hansen from Regenerative Masters in Minnesota. I've been doing fluoroquinolone toxicity work for about 15 years. We're going to be doing a series every Tuesday night, 7:30 Central Time on the ABCs and XYZs of fluoroquinolone toxicity. I'm going to try to keep these simple, but also accessible and deep enough for everybody to start to have an understanding of where to go, what to do, and how to approach this condition. There should be at least 16 major segments, each of which will be broken down into even smaller parts. I'll probably experiment a little bit with the amount of depth and the amount of interaction with the entire community as I do these. This one is going to be just the basic, what is fluoroquinolone toxicity and how is it diagnosed and what do I do? The first kinds of questions that everybody's asking when they start to have symptoms. Okay, so our agenda. What is fluoroquinolone-associated disability? And I would say I like fluoroquinolone-associated injury better than fluoroquinolone-associated disability or disease. We're going to talk a little bit about who's at risk. What are the common initial symptoms? How does fluoroquinolone-associated injuries be diagnosed, and what should I do about it? We'll have a question and answer time at the end of going through the slides. I've kept them pretty simple for the first one. I want to leave at least half my amount of time for questions for everyone. So what's the basic history of fluoroquinolones? You can go through this in extensive detail from the original molecules that were created in the 1960s to the various derivations, the ones that have been recalled, and the first groups out there that were starting to talk about this. The first physician that was starting to treat it systematically, and that was Dr. Cohen. He was the first one to put out a book. And then the how do we test it and how do we recognize it? All right. So 1960s, the initial molecule was used. These are entirely synthetic molecules. They were tested for many different purposes, including chemotherapy agents, before there was found to be DNA gyrase and other activity that were antibacterial. 1980s, they were ciprofloxacin was the first one approved for use. First black box warning didn't come until 2008. That was when Achilles tendinopathy or rupture was put out there as a black box warning. It takes a long time to get one of those. It's the most strict warning from the FDA, and there's got to be a lot of reports and a lot of documentation. Back then, I always thought that the molecule must be really smart if it only knew to get the Achilles. You should be laughing or crying at that, one of the two. I'm not sure which. But now there's 8 black box warnings, several that have been rejected that have been suggested, and then there's 23 total warnings. This is the last time I looked anyway. My longest term patient had fluoroquinolone symptoms since 1987. You'll see these kinds of things on my presentations. So my way of making a structure for how to approach healing. You guys helped me to be this complicated. About 50% of my patients in my clinic in the last 8 years have been fluoroquinolone patients. And I borrowed most of my protocols from all my other conditions for fluoroquinolone patients, be it structure, neurology, physiology, deep emotion, and energetic treatments. And how do you approach a human top to bottom? That's where it came. So here's my definition for it. A heterogeneous group of multi-system and multi-tissue dysfunctions with variable penetration, that is how severe it presents and to what populations it presents in, how it presents, the symptomatology and severity with an undulating course that's best characterized as a syndrome. If you like the Incredibles and you like it being called a syndrome better than you would a disability, I'd imagine. But that's the way I define it at the moment. I've had more complex definitions than that in the past. Who's at risk? You see the list there. Um, Elderly for multiple reasons. The other things are basically breaking down, so there's not as many accommodating patterns for the body to be able to keep up with the kind of things that are happening from the fluoroquinolones up at the front side. Pediatric, this was put out there actually as a warning because animals with immature cartilage were shown to have significant erosion of the cartilage, amongst other reasons, but that was the original reason why it was limited in children. In my practice, there's women more than men, but there are some studies showing men more than women. Renal disease, hyperinflammatory states. Previous injuries is an interesting one. Previous areas that have been painful and challenging for somebody, say like sciatica, end up much more symptomatic after fluoroquinolone are taken. I think that there's less buffer for the body before it starts to have symptoms. Other previous nerve issues, mitochondrial diseases, and Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. This list could be quite a bit longer. I mean, if you have leaky gut already, if you have leaky brain already, if you have hyperinflammatory, other kinds of rheumatologic reasons for having symptoms already. All these are really common. And then the initial symptoms could also be far longer than this. A lot of neurologic, emotional, and then other pain kind of symptomatologies that pop up very early. It's not very common for somebody to say, well, I have diabetes and it flared up right when I took my first pill. That's not the typical initial presentation, but that's a significant risk and possibility later down the road. But joint dysfunction, old injured areas, GI disturbances, and then something that we'll probably spend about 3 or 4 weeks on will be floxy neck. One of my premises of working with humanity is that most of us have injured upper necks. And because of loss of soft tissue and collagen and loss of neurologic function, the neck ends up being a very prime area for symptoms, including all of the neurologic and emotional ones being either brand new or significantly worsened. Okay, so the diagnosis, this is a hard thing for everybody to hear usually. It's a diagnosis of exclusion, which it doesn't sit well to me. In medicine, we typically sit down with a patient or have them fill out a form that says, okay, you started to have symptoms when, and what did you do, and what's associated with this? What did you take? What did you eat? What did you, this is taking a basic history. And when you say to somebody, I got that IV drip of Cipro, and in 20 minutes I couldn't walk, and my entire body burned all over the place. And somebody says to you, well, we have to make this a diagnosis of exclusion, meaning we have to make sure it's not everything else before we could say that it might possibly be fluoroquinolone toxicity. Now, unfortunately, there is no ICD-10 code for fluoroquinolone toxicity. And I've had 3 patients as recent as 2 years ago that have done $100,000 workups at very famous clinics in the United States, in fact, in Minnesota, and been told, well, you probably have this, but we can't diagnose you with it because there is no code for it, which is one of the more ridiculous things that I've heard out of my profession. But there are a lot of mimickers that almost have to be said, well, you don't have this because you don't meet A, B, C, and XYZ requirements like fibromyalgia, physical polymyalgia rheumatica, rheumatologic conditions, psychiatric, mitochondrial, even MS or other DNA adduct sources. Interesting, somebody that's very prominent in the fluoroquinolone community told me that early on in studies, they all had plaques that mimicked MS that ended up resolving. I need to get some more information on that, but this could be a significant misdiagnosis for fluoroquinolone toxicity. And as I said before, one of my biases is that potentially you're hitting so many different systems and functions, healing, repair mechanisms, immune system, endocrine system, simultaneously, that things that are under the surface and not poking out as the actual iceberg may become symptomatic even though they were already problems. So it's an unmasking process that occurs because of the multi-hit challenge that occurs with fluoroquinolone toxicity. As I said, I was going to keep this one short. Um, so what should you do on your own? Having been in the community for a really long time, I've created some lists of things that people should do, different supplements, and just being evaluated, I think is really important. How do you help others? This is something you're going to hear from me a lot, and I put out on the FAHA Facebook group. Um, if you look at your fingerprints, nobody else in the world, unless you have an identical twin, has those fingerprints. No two people, even identical twins, have the same immune system or the same endocrine system or the same neurologic system. What works for one person does not necessarily work for anybody else. And in the wrong set of circumstances, something that was very helpful for somebody might be extremely detrimental to somebody else. So one of the things in the FAHA Facebook group is that people are not asking for guidance nor giving guidance to one another for specific treatments, supporting one another through processes to help understand what's happening in that person specifically, specific and individualized evaluations, and just supporting one another through the process of discovery and healing is what we do. And I try to avoid the concept of the blind leading the blind. If I've been working on this for 15 years and I was a physician for 10 years before that, if I don't feel comfortable telling somebody what diet they should eat because a diet is that different from person to person, on testing, I've actually seen people that are severely allergic to raspberries or lima beans or kale. There isn't anything that you can do to specifically guide somebody else's care. Even even doing something as simple uh, um, as a sauna, which is commonly discussed. If your phase 3 conjugation mechanisms aren't working well in your liver, you're going to have a significant metabolic reaction, oftentimes referred to as refluxing, if you start to do a sauna. There are a lot of steps and a lot of landmines to avoid for yourself and particularly for guiding other people. So encouraging people through their own processes is important, and that's much more valuable than telling them, hey, this worked for me, it might work for you too. So part of the FAHA organization that actually stands for Fluoroquinolone Antibiotic Awareness and Healing Alliance. So the awareness piece of it, we have already talked to medical schools. I've given talks to other groups of physicians. I've given TV talks, television clips on fluoroquinolone toxicity. I know the Toronto group just did some work up there. It is starting to work. There are the younger physicians that are coming out are much more cognizant of fluoroquinolone issues than the ones that have been around for a long time. Still, I see people that are put on 4 to 6 week courses of Cipro for prostatitis that very likely is not bacterial. So there will be ways for us to try to work through that. There's one of the individuals that's been a patient of mine that works with the military that's trying to shout loud and hard on the effects of fluoroquinolones. There will be other ways to do that as well. And then the evaluation process that we developed at Regenerative Masters, it was specifically for fluoroquinolone toxicity to remotely understand from a dietary, physiologic, structural, neurologic, and psychologic standpoint, how does somebody rate in their evaluation. Actually have two very long evaluation forms to be evaluated, and four of us that will work with people remotely to assess, evaluate, and guide people. So that's become my bias, because this is, again, so many different symptoms, so much different penetration. Everybody's genetics is different. Everybody's previous injuries, everybody's current or previous medical condition histories are all so different that this makes this the most complex and variable condition on the planet, in my opinion. So from that standpoint, I'm going to encourage everybody to be um, as supportive as you can of one another without inadvertently putting somebody else in harm's way. You'll hear this from me early and often as we go through this series, which is going to go through probably a good 50 different segments of assessment and care for the condition. At the end of that, the goal is to have a book to put out for everyone to be able to go through the condition and understand how it's affecting you and how to approach it, so there can be some common understanding amongst people who are starting to have the symptoms, but also amongst medical providers. And I'll ask a favor of everybody. Try to be patient with the medical providers. I tend to naturally assume that people's symptoms are real and that they are at least explaining them as good as they can with the understanding in a challenging situation that they can. A lot of practitioners have no understanding of this condition. And when something is really complex, just like anybody else, when you don't feel adequate for being able to do something, you react in a negative sort of way. One of the things that'll come out of this series is a list of things to discuss with your providers, so they feel like they can work with you and feel you can feel legitimized, and they can feel comfortable kind of in their non-knowingness early on, and you can start to develop relationships with providers that way. One of the goals of FAHA is to have not standardized care, but a standardized approach and processes to evaluating, assessing, and understanding people, so that we'll have providers around the country that are starting to be able to do this in a consistent way, and then with consistent ways to be able to guide people. That was always one of the goals. That's what I started doing about 4 years ago. As it got up and started moving with COVID, everything really slowed down and ground to a halt. And now I'm getting back to some of those original ideals and hopes of what to do for the condition and for the community. There'll be a lot to share in the next coming weeks and months. Looking forward to doing a lot of that with you. We're going to shut down for tonight, and we will see you next week.